So another set for Legends of Runeterra has come out, Guardians of the Ancients. And of course you come to Boulevard's tournament tier list to figure out what week 1 will look like. Because he's cornered the market and has the only tournament tier list out there. As far as I know anyway. Please don't leave me if somebody else makes a tournament tier list. I promise mine's good. So, a couple of quick points before we get into things. Number 1, take a look at the sample list. You'll notice that I've adjusted it so that all of the sample deck lists are actually the name of the champion rather than the name of the archetype. Name of the archetype or the name of the deck or whatever will go over here, and then the champions in it will go in the sample list. That way, if you're a newer player looking to get in the competitive scene and you only have so many cards, so many champions, especially with Crush Shard going away, if you're smurfing on a different region, you only have so many champions, you can just Control F your favorite champion or the champion that you want to play and see which decks you're actually able to bring. So I thought that was something that would help out some of the newer players out there. Number 2, the champions in Guardians of the Ancient, Aurelia, Zilean, and Malphite are very complex. They do a lot of different things, and what that means is that they're going to take a while to figure out. I have very little hope in Week 1 Zilean decks. I have no hope in Week 1 Malphite decks. And Aurelia, because she goes into an aggro deck, is a lot easier to figure out. Zilean, I don't think players have even figured out the right regional combination for him, let alone the right deck for him, and I think that Zilean is going to be a good card. I just don't think it's Week 1. Not at all. I would put him in Tier 3 if I even had any Zilean decks on here Week 1. Which I did put in the Zilean Nasus Go Hard, but I mean, like, there are a couple of Zilean decks that I've seen, like Zilean Swain, Zilean Lysandra, the Thralls. I'm not confident about that deck either. I didn't even put it on the tier list. But I did just want to throw out that, like, don't be discouraged by the fact that Zilean's not going to fucking do anything this weekend. Zilean is going to take a while to figure out, much like Heimerdinger before him. Heimerdinger wasn't the best day 1 deck in beta, but we knew that eventually it would be very good. You just have to give people time to figure it out. For aggro decks, they're a lot easier to figure out because an unrefined aggro deck is going to do a lot better than an unrefined control deck. And control decks tend to need to wait for the meta to settle and know what it looks like so they know what they're countering, what cards to put in, things like that. So hopeful for Zilean, not hopeful for Malphite. Aurelia is already here. So, let's get into Tier 1. Now, Thresh Nasus, TLC, and Zoe Lee remain relatively unchanged in the builds. Obviously, there were some nerfs to Thresh Nasus, but all it did was really change it from having a good matchup against everything to a slightly closer to even matchup against everything, which ultimately still means it's one of the best decks in the format. And I think that TLC, no one's really going to argue on that one, and Zoe Lee is a deck that I have just kind of come to the understanding that as long as Zoe Lee exists in its current form, it will be a Tier 1 deck. I don't care how much aggro is in the meta. I think that Zoe Lee is just going to stay up there in terms of tournament performance, and even if it's only 1 out of the top 8, the chances that it's going to be the 1 out of the top 8 that wins the tournament are extremely high. Newcomers to Tier 1, we have Draven Ezreal. Draven Ezreal is sort of the new Shen Fiora. I used to praise Shen Fiora a lot as the best deck to bring into an open format because it has game against everything. And Draven Ezreal sort of feels like the new safe choice. It does very well against aggro, does very well against mid-range, and there's really not a lot of control decks in the game, and even there you have a little bit of game. Frostbite mid-range, obviously, Thresh Nasus, Trundle Lysandra, and Zoe Lee Sin are still going to be very popular decks. Even Aesol Demacia probably going to be very popular this weekend. And Frostbite midrange does very well against all of them. Now, it feels weird to put Draven Ezreal and Frostbite midrange in Tier 1 because Draven Ezreal absolutely hoses Frostbite midrange, but I don't know how popular Draven Ezreal is going to be comparative to Frostbite midrange. And I mean, if you're playing against Thresh Nasus, Lysandra, and Draven Ezreal, you just ban the Draven Ezreal because you want to bring Frostbite midrange into Thresh Nasus and Lysandra, especially as more and more players are going for the Marauder version of that deck, which has a little bit more game against Lysandra. But I still prefer the traditional build versus the Marauder build, but of course, it is up to you. And then the newcomer to Tier 1, one of the newcoming decks out of Guardians of the Ancient, definitely the breakout deck on Week 1, is Aurelia Azir. Now, Aurelia does 7 different things, like Lysandra before her and Aphelios before her. It's another 3-cost champion that just does way too many things, and anybody who has played ladder understands what this deck does, what it's capable of, the amount of dipping and dodging that Aurelia can do, how difficult it is for decks to deal with Azir having 5 HP. So obviously this deck is going to come out at Tier number 1. Now, I don't think there are going to be a lot of triple aggro lineups. I know that players always talk about, oh, you know, a new set dropped, aggro is going to be everywhere. And that's always true for ladder. It's not as true for tournaments. It was true after TF Fizz got nerfed, but that was a little bit more, that wasn't even like Shurima dropped, it was more like TF Fizz got nerfed and all these other decks got nerfed, and Trundle Lysandra was sort of the only thing that we knew that we could hang on to that was sort of left over from the previous format. You know, Shen Fiora had to go, all that kind of stuff, so it made sense in that context that aggro rose up. I don't think aggro is going to rise up this time around, mostly because the other sort of new deck that's doing very on ladder is Azir Darius, and Riot Lock, you can't run two Azir decks. That should be pretty self-explanatory. I don't think any of the other 12 one-drop decks got any better. I think that Lissandra still does very well against all of them, and historically the only decks that Lissandra has struggled with on the aggro side of things is the Azir decks, and you can only have one of those, so the Lissandra lineups just get to ban the one Azir deck, and then you're left with some questionable choices. So I don't think that triple aggro is going to be very popular, but I do think that Aurelia Azir could definitely slot in as the third deck in a pretty standard lineup. I think it is just that good. Then down in tier 2, I'm not going to go over everything because a lot of these things have stayed the same. Obviously, Deep got Bone Skewer. Haven't actually seen how that performed. Don't imagine it really pumps Deep up too much. Overwhelm moves from tier 3 up to tier 2 as the format rolls over. Obviously, Merciless Hunter is a really big, impactful card for pretty much every Shurima deck across the board, but I think that Overwhelm absolutely gets the most out of it. Players have started to, cut out the Avaros and Trappers, put in the Merciless Hunter, start to get more value out of their Omen Hawks and their Rock Hoppers and things like that, and just the amount of vulnerable that is coming down onto every unit is really good for what this deck wants to be doing, especially Renekton, as well as the fact that it just has good matchups into a lot of the better decks in the format. And one thing that you'll notice here is that there are 3 champions in this deck. I constantly preach that 3 champions in a deck is really just a sign that the deck is unrefined. Players haven't really figured out the optimal lineup for it yet. And I do want to mention that there is an exception to this. And it is, if one of the champions is Sejuani, you're allowed to run 3 champions. And this is something that we've seen happen a lot. Frostbite midrange, never really ran 3 Sejuani. Most of these decks never really wanted to run 3 Sejuani. And for a while, Ash LeBlanc Sejuani was a thing. Even Ash Riven Sejuani was a thing for a little while. Ash Katarina Sejuani or Ash Katarina LeBlanc. Frostbite midrange gets some exceptions as well. But, now we're throwing in 1 Sivir instead of the Sejuani. Really beef up that 4-drop spot like the Renekton. Even the Teemo Sejuani Ezreal, just another 3 champion split with the Sejuani in it. So going forward, I always talk crap about 3 champion decks. Sejuani decks are the exception. Moving forward, let's get that out of the way. Shen Jarvan still doing fine, kind of like Aesol Demacia. I think that these decks are going to do fairly well week 1, just sort of, trying to prepare for the players that have brought triple aggro. Once again, don't think there's going to be a lot of triple aggro, so it might be a little bit of a bait to go for a full anti-aggro lineup. I think you're still going to run into a lot of TLC and Thresh Nasus, followed by a third deck. Now, be that Aurelia Azir, be that Lee Sin, be that Aesol Demacia, be that Draven Ezreal, that's all kind of up in the air. I think that there's a lot of space for the Thresh Nasus to get overtaken as well. Players just not wanting to deal with this week 1 nerf deck and just play like TLC, Draven Ezreal, and Aesol Demacia. Something along those lines could be a very reasonable lineup. Moving on, Nightfall still doing pretty well for itself, along with Stony Suppressor Scouts and Aesol Demacia and Mind Meld, Brimflesh, and Invoke. I have no idea what Invoke is going to look like. Don't click on the sample list. I'm really waiting to see what Am I brings this weekend. He is always my saving grace when it comes to figuring out what Mountain Scryer decks look like. Obviously, Targon got a lot of cool new tools, but none of them really fundamentally change the way that you're going to be playing a Mountain Scryer deck. They're just things you can replace Mountain Goat with, so not ultimately sure what that's going to look like. Maybe Leona Star, I don't know. I don't even want to speculate there. Legion Marauders still, I think, is a little bit worse than the Frostbite midrange deck. Just a little bit more inconsistent, but it is popular. It is very doable in terms of winning a tournament with it. Discard aggro. The Rubin Pile, I kind of had meant to put on the tier list a while ago, but just never did. That's on there now. I think this deck is actually pretty solid because it will deal with the sparse amount of aggro that you see. It's just a really safe deck. It's a pretty value-oriented deck, and it has game against a lot of things. I'm a pretty big fan of this deck. I might even bring it this weekend if I were playing in a tournament, but of course I'm not. I'm casting. The Darius Azir deck, this deck is good, but once again, I don't think this is something that I want to run outside of a triple aggro lineup, and I don't really like triple aggro right now, and also, I don't think Darius Azir is better than Aurelia Azir, and as such, it has to be in tier 2 because that should not be the Azir deck that you are playing. One other aggro deck that I did want to highlight, though, is the Shirian Posse, the mono Teemo aggro style of deck that Swim came up with, playing like Doom Beasts and things like that. I could see this deck popping up sparsely. It might even be able to squeak out a top 8, but it is something that I want players to kind of be aware of, and if there is a triple aggro lineup, I would almost be unsurprised to see this in it and see players really experiment with the new cards and be like, yeah, I'm going to bring, Shirian Posse aggro, I'm going to bring Aurelia Azir, and I'm going to bring a third aggro deck that I don't know what it looks like. Maybe even Scargrounds, Scargrounds, another new addition to the tier list, something that I meant to put on a while ago, but more and more Scargrounds is just getting more and more counter matchups in tier 1. Obviously, always did very well into Trundle Lissandra, does pretty good into Thresh Nasus, and now, of course, does pretty well into Aurelia Azir as well, because Scargrounds gives you permanent blockers on the blades because they get damaged. The first time they get tough. Now I have tough blockers. I go and block the blades. It's actually detrimental for the Aurelia deck to be going in with both the blades and the Sand Soldiers at that point. So a pretty big fan of Scar Grounds' place in the meta. Not sure that I personally would have the balls to bring it, but hey, it's there. Go hard. Once again, I'd mentioned earlier, not a fan of the Zillion Nasus, not a fan of the Zillion decks day one in general. I think that Zillion will have a place in the meta, just not so much week one. Frostbite Foundry performed very well at the seasonal, but I think that there's going to be potentially a little bit too much aggro. It's kind of hard to say. You know, Draven Ezreal also running around. A lot of the players are on one Scorched Earth and one Noxian Guillotine, but I think for tournaments, players are really going to hone in on the double Scorched Earth, mostly to deal with Emperor's Dais, partially to deal with cheesy Lysandra, you know, Shurima decks, but also does just have this added benefit of, hey, I get to kill your Foundry, and that can be a little bit rough for you, and they might even leave the Foundry around because it's good for that deck to just have a lot of draw power. So not really loving Frostbite Foundry's position in the meta right now, not expecting a lot of Lee Sin at all, so I think tier 3 is fine. Still a viable deck, of course. You can win a tournament with it. If you couldn't, it wouldn't be on the tier list. Lucian Azir, sort of now the third worst Azir deck in the format as it stands out. Unfortunately for Lucian Azir, you know, you're not the new kid on the block. No one's going to want to bust out Lucian Azir this weekend. Everyone's going to want to bust out the Aurelia Azir. That's the cool new thing to do. Spiders and Pirate Aggro, as I had mentioned, not really a fan of Aggro's positioning because we are still in a TLC and Nasus format. That's why I don't think you're going to see a lot of Aggro decks. Aurelia Azir and Azir decks in general will be able to beat that lineup, but you can only bring one of those and nothing else really plays like it. So I'm hoping that nobody just like slams Emperor's Dais and like 2 other champions and just says, you know what, this is good enough. I don't even need the Azir. I'll just play the Emperor's Dais, but we'll see. Somebody could be crazy enough to do that. And then rounding it out, we have Starspring. I actually feel like Starspring is really well positioned into the meta. I just think that in an unpredictable meta like this, Starspring is not something that you can afford to bring. It has a lot of really good matchups, but when you're going into an open format, you have very safe decks like Draven Ezreal, like Shen Fiora, and then you have very risky decks, and that's where Starspring kind of falls in. So while it looks good on paper into a lot of the things that you're going to expect to be seeing, you could just run into somebody that just wanted to try out 3 new decks and lose on your Starspring. And I don't care how good of a player you are, that is something that can realistically happen to you. Either your deck bricks or they just do some weird high rolly thing and it happens to be a strategy that the Tahm Kench Soraka doesn't pair very well into. Also, I expect a high presence of Draven Ezreal. Once again, that is one of the worst matchups for Starspring. So as much as I like this deck, as much as I think that somebody could take it and perform very well running into the right string of matchups, I think that the meta is too volatile right now for me to recommend this or put it really anywhere near the top of the tier list. Now, as far as what I would bring this weekend, I'm not really the kind of person that wants to bust out the new cards and have fun with the kooky day one decks because I feel like more often than not, they're pretty inconsistent. You're not going to have the best tournament experience if you do it. I don't really care if I don't end up playing any new cards. They're not going anywhere. I'll have time to play them when the decks are more refined. So were I playing in a tournament this weekend, I would be bringing Trundle Lysandra because I've played an insane amount of that deck, Draven Ezreal, and Zoe Vi. I'm looking to have a little bit of fun, but keep it tight. You know, I've got these safe decks. I game against aggro, game against pretty much everything else. I'm not really the biggest fan of Thresh Nasus, never really was. I was looking for reasons to talk myself out of playing that deck in the seasonal. Couldn't find any, ended up running it, but now the nerfs are enough, at least for me to want to put it down for a week, so I'd be really happy with that lineup. There's no overlap as far as I can tell. Yeah, no. And I probably wouldn't even bring Draven Ezreal. I've actually been playing a lot of Draven Swain on ladder, just because I've always been a much bigger fan of the Draven Swain instead of the Draven Ezreal. It's one of the reasons that I hate on Draven Ezreal so much. It's because I think that Draven Swain was just always kind of better. But that's just a personal preference thing. I really like having the extra meat on the bones in my deck, having that 5-cost unit that gets to put a lot of pressure onto both my opponent's life total on the board. So yeah, that's what I would bring. Trundle Lysandra, Draven Swain, Zoe Vi. So thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. As always, good luck in your tournaments. Of course, the online league series will be running again this weekend. I will have a link for the sign up down that on below. It's running in the Riot format, and you can come watch that at twitch.tv/JDozaGG to watch myself and JDoza casting it. It'll be 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. So if you can't make it, come out and watch it at least, and we'll try to get as many kooky decks on camera as we can in the early rounds and make sure that everybody has a good time. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and good luck this weekend.